there was even one guy called A.K. Judney, I think his name was. He actually went up in a light aircraft and he tried to make phone calls. And it basically didn't work. You know, he wrote it all up, and you can read that report if you want. And then there are other problems with the stories of the planes. For example, one of the big ones, which isn't spoken about that much, is there are no testimonies from any of the ground crew, any of the airports, to any of the alleged hijackers getting on the planes. So that we're talking about people that were on the ground, you know, nothing that happened in the air, no phone calls. None of the ground staff have ever identified any of the named hijackers as being getting on the planes, going through the gates and that. There's been no record of that. There's no CCTV footage of them. There's been one bit of CCTV footage of, allegedly, of Mohammed Atta, one of the hijackers, but that was, the date on that is the 10th of September, so it wasn't the date. So we don't really have any evidence of hijackers getting on the planes. Elias Davidson's written that quite well, and I've got a link to that on my website. Anybody watching this can write to me for any of these links if they wish, from checktheevidence.com. So we don't have any evidence of hijackers. What about the passengers? Were there any passengers? Well, again, we have some evidence. They did release some passenger lists, for example, but though the changes in those passenger lists were there were changes on them. They released different versions at different times, slightly different versions. I think some different versions on CNN and stuff. So you know, you've got that problem. And so what about, for example, radar tracks? Well, radar tracks, yes, they have some, but there were also these exercises going on. There was this exercise called Vigilant Guardian going on.
There was exercise, isn't there?
Yeah.
Well, same with the 7/7 attacks.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, you know, they were putting false radar blips into the system to test for, you know, how the air traffic controllers would respond and stuff. You know, that's what I've heard anyway. So that evidence is tainted. You start to look at the NTSB records, which is the National Transport Safety Board, I think, for the US, and they show that only 2 of the flights were scheduled to fly on September the 11th. Those particular flights. The other 2 flights don't fly on you know, Tuesdays or whatever. And the 2 flights that did fly, I think, there were anomalies in the record of their destruction. They should be registered as destroyed in 24 hours, and some of these records were cropping up as still in use, you know, a year or 2 years later. Some of that's covered in the Loose Change film. Actually. And then you have the situation which is covered in the September Clues film a little bit, although I don't trust that film. That shows you some of the reporters going to, I think there's an airport, it's LAX, Los Angeles International. A reporter went there to try and greet, you know, see if there were families there that had come to meet the passengers that were supposed to get off the plane that was supposed to have landed there but didn't because it was allegedly hijacked. And there were no families there. They couldn't find anybody. They evacuated that airport apparently, and there was hardly anybody there. You couldn't find anybody. You know, and so what happened to the passengers? Were there any real passengers? You know, like I say, we don't know, because once those flights were up in the air, even if those 2 flights did fly out before, where did they go? And the Loose Change film, again, there's some. I've been talking to Mark Conlon. There's a chap who runs a blog called Mark Conlon, blogspot.co.uk or .com, with a dash in there, Mark-Conlon. He's been doing a lot of research into that, and he's come to the conclusion that the Loose Change film, there's a lot of disinformation in there, because he thinks these planes went a different route. I think he mentioned that they possibly landed at Reagan Airport, I think, or they flew over Reagan Airport. I know he told me that. There was this other story that the flights had landed at Cleveland Airport, and that's in the Loose Change film, the second one. I think Mark thinks that's disinformation now, but nevertheless, we cannot get straight stories about the passengers, the planes, where they land, you know, where they allegedly landed, if they didn't crash. There's certain questions about that, and when these stories came into being. So I cannot make myself happy that these planes actually took off, and that there were passengers on them. You know, I think those plane stories, a bit like we've seen some of these latter stories, could have been completely made up. You know, there maybe weren't any planes, or if 2 flights did indeed take off, where did they land? Did they, fly them below the radar and ditch them in the sea? Did they fly them to some remote desert, having switched off any detection methods? The NSA will know where they ended up, because they could track all these things. And the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office, so people could maybe do a freedom of information request to the NRO and the NSA to ask where the flights, on what record they've got of 9/11 flights, in their system. But are they going to trust the responses that they get back?